This video will cover the September-October topic, which is that resolved in the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized testing in undergraduate admissions decisions. So let's get started. First, let's start with a little bit of background on the topic. One of the most important terms in the resolution is what is a standardized test. So a standardized test is, quote, an assessment that is designed and administered in a uniform fashion, end quote. So this sounds very nebulous, but the most common standardized tests, as I'm sure you know, that are considered by colleges would be the SAT subject test, the ACT, AP exams, and then TOEFL, which is the test of English as a first language, test of English as a foreign language. And when you have a standardized test, it means that the time across everyone who takes the test is standardized or the same, so are the questions and the instructions, etc. So the goal of a standardized test is essentially to evaluate the test takers in an objective fashion so that there are no fluctuations with results because of subjective things like bias, as in, like, with a teacher recommendation, some teachers might write recommendations better than others, or GPA. Some schools might inflate GPAs more than other schools. So standardized tests are meant to be uniform across the board. A little bit of history on standardized tests. It was Horace Mann who had the original idea of standardized testing in the late 1800s. And then the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT, began in the 1920s. And then later the ACT was created as an alternative to the SAT. And now testing is instrumental in college decisions, as I'm sure all of you know. However, there's a growing trend where over 1,000 colleges have become test optional. So right now we are seeing that colleges are kind of at a crossroads. Some are deciding to go test optional, some still believe in the importance of tests. So this is really where the crux of the debate comes down to, which is, are tests important enough that we need to continue to consider them in college admissions, or are there inherent problems with these tests that mean we should not? So let's move on to one final question we have to discuss before we talk about af and neg arguments, which is why are standardized tests used? I've covered this a little bit, but again, I will just say we made them to eliminate subjectivity so that there's a uniform metric to judge students' intellect, and they were intended to level the playing field, because if you think about it, students who are wealthy and usually white will usually have access to the best schools, which means it's easier for them to get into these colleges. So when standardized tests were created, it was in its ideal form a way for poor and minority students to be able to show their ability so that there was no subjectivity going into who was getting into these schools. However, as we've seen, although the intention of standardized tests is to level the playing field, it does not always end up working out that way. This leads me to our first af argument, which is that standardized tests are discriminatory. Although, they may not be discriminatory in principle, in practice, what we see is that test prep is predominantly available to upper class, and education is better for the upper class because they are able to go to better, private schools often, go into more in depth in topics, whereas in public school, you have fewer teachers, you have more kids, there might be a lower quality of education or less attention being given to students that need an individualized focus. So this ultimately leads to the opportunity gap. Other factors that contribute to the opportunity gap are housing, crime rates, and income levels. All of these are things that are usually worse for Latino and African American students, that affect them at a greater rate than white or Asian students, as we've seen empirically. So when you have, Latino and African American students living in areas where there is increased crime rates, where housing is worse, where income levels are lower, where they're not getting as much attention in school, it leads to something called the achievement gap, where we see that empirically average test scores for Latinos and African American students are lower than those of whites and Asian students. You can see I've put a link to the article that discusses this. It very clearly shows that whether we like it or not, standardized tests do illustrate the ways in which Blacks and Latinos are disadvantaged in our society. Moreover, NACAC, I forget exactly what this stands for, but if you type this in this quote, you should be able to find it. They found that schools that do not require the SAT/ACT saw an increased enrollment of underrepresented students of color relative to comparable institutions that require a test score. This is for a few reasons. The first is that a lot of the times when students don't have good test scores, they are, afraid to submit their application to higher level institutions. They think my test score is not good enough to get in here, so they decide not to submit an application. Once you go test optional, what these schools saw is that the number of applicants increases dramatically, and it means that colleges are able to admit more minorities. And they saw that it became, because they end up submitting applications, and these colleges ended up, as we've seen, becoming a lot more diverse when they implemented a test optional policy. So even though these tests are efficient, that does not mean they are fair. And the AF would argue that, just because it might be necessary for us to have an objective test does not mean that the standardized test that we have right now should be considered. Also, another argument that the AF can make is that test scores correlate to poverty. As the Research for Action studied Philadelphia, they found that of more than 2,200 schools in their sample, 187 post-proficiency rates or 90 of above. Of these, just 7 schools, 3.7%, have economically disadvantaged enrollments of 50% or higher. 5 of the 7 are Philadelphia magnet schools. So what this evidence says further shows that our argument that test scores are discriminatory or that these standardized tests reflect inequalities, this bolsters that, because it shows that people in lower income areas and lower income brackets had lower test scores because they didn't have access to things like test prep, to individualized attention in school, etc. Another AF argument that might be made is that college admissions, they've become more competitive, and as we've seen that this is happening, depression, anxiety, and suicide have all increased among high schoolers. And some academics believe that getting rid of standardized tests could be helpful for this. I'm not sure exactly what, an AF would look like that makes this argument, but it's certainly something to consider if you're writing a structural violence AF is another argument that you can include with the arguments that you're making. A lot of academics have also recommended using something called holistic review, where students are considered in the context of their resources. College admissions purport to use holistic review right now, but as we've seen, a lot of emphasis has been given to standardized tests. So an affirmative might argue that colleges should embrace a holistic review by getting rid of these tests. And another argument, as I've discussed again, is that once we get rid of these tests, there's greater diversity on these campuses because test optional colleges saw greater representation of Black and Latino students. Some more AF arguments that you will commonly hear on the topic. One is that standardized tests decrease the quality of learning because then students are only learning towards the test and teachers are not able to actually discuss things that they believe are important to their students' education. Another argument is that grade point average better illustrates the work ethic and diligence of a student, as standardized tests will just end up assessing a particular performance on a particular day. In fact, studies have shown that GPA is a better indicator of success in college than a standardized test score. They saw that students with higher grade point averages ultimately went on to choose harder courses. Students with higher GPAs ultimately went on to choose higher courses, and that they ultimately ended up having more success in college. Another final argument for the affirmative is that the College Board profits off of tests and the 8.6% of their revenue is taken, it purports to be a nonprofit. The College Board is technically a nonprofit. However, its executives are making hundreds of thousands of dollars. I believe that is correct. But regardless, they are profiting immensely off of these tests, and the argument could be made that these tests perpetuate capitalism. Another argument could be that, the commodification of knowledge through these tests, which play such an integral role in college admissions, depletes learning and means that we are no longer learning for the sake of learning, which is another kind of capitalist-style argument that you could consider when you are writing your AF. Now let's go on to the negative side of the debate. The first argument that you might want to consider is that there is just no other objective option. As bad as standardized tests are, getting rid of them would be worse, and it would exacerbate all of the issues that the affirmative talks about. The affirmative is right, to emphasize that disadvantaged and minority students and disadvantaged students who come from poor backgrounds are left behind these wealthy students who are able to access things like test prep and individualized attention. However, once you get rid of standardized tests, it eliminates any kind of objective measure where wealthy students are able to, be judged on the same metric as poor students or minority students, etc. Teacher recommendations, for example, will always be better in private schools. Well, not always, but will tend to be better in private schools where kids have smaller classes because teachers will be better able to pay attention to their students. Interviews are very subjective. They depend on the interviewer and how they perceive a person. Moreover, biases that are inherent to everyone can affect interviews. GPAs also vary from school to school. Some schools might inflate their GPAs, some schools might deflate their GPAs, some schools might count pluses and minuses in their GPA, some schools might not. So what you see is that the wealthy end up being benefited even more once you eliminate this type of objective measure. This is illustrated in the fact that grade inflation has risen while standardized test scores have remained level. So as we see grade inflation rise, it makes it hard to distinguish between students and what they're achieving, especially at rich, predominantly Caucasian schools, where you see these rich, predominantly Caucasian individuals who are at these schools, these students, all getting incredibly high GPAs because of grade inflation, and you can't tell who is really, the smartest student in the class because everyone has a 4.0. Let's continue. So some schools drop test requirements to seem more selective because more applicants mean more rejections. Essentially what this argument is that when you go test optional or when you stop considering tests, all it really does is lead to more people applying to these schools, but it doesn't mean that the schools actually end up becoming more diverse in the long run. This is an argument that the negative can make against the affirmative. It's something that you should consider researching. Another argument that the negative can make is that standardized tests are a good indicator of success. This can refute the argument about GPA. First, you could say that, GPA is inflated from school to school. The inflation levels vary. But second, the Wall Street Journal wrote that students with high standardized test scores went on to pursue more rigorous courses and careers. I might have mentioned courses with the earlier study, I believe the NACAC study. I was not correct to mention the courses there. I think that study just said that they saw more success in college. This one says that standardized test scores correlate with success in their students' careers and also correlate to students pursuing more rigorous courses. Here's some more final negative arguments. One is that it is better to improve these tests than to abandon them altogether. The negative can make an argument that, agree with the affirmative, these tests are not perfect, but we should just end up reforming them. The negative could also argue that colleges should just assign the test less weight and importance. They could also train officers to evaluate these tests differently, i.e. to, actually adopt the holistic viewpoint, the holistic method that they have been claiming that they practice in admissions and really evaluate the applications with less importance on the test, knowing the issues that the affirmative talks about. However, you can argue that none of the issues that the affirmative talks about are inherent to standardized tests, and they're an important tool to keep in our toolbox so that we don't just rely on subjective methods that largely end up privileging the white and the wealthy students who have access to more resources than disadvantaged and minorities. Or we could also consider if it is permissible for the negative to argue that colleges should be test optional, right? The resolution says that colleges ought not consider standardized tests. Presumably, this means that colleges would not be considering standardized tests under any circumstance. So depending on the affirmative advocacy, the negative can just argue for test optional policies, which I think would be really strategic for the negative because I think it would allow the negative to co-opt a lot of the affirmative's offense, right? Because you're still saying, look, colleges can make this decision. However, if students want to submit these tests to show that they have mastered their material to allow for some kind of objective measure, then they can submit it. That's my topic analysis. I hope it was helpful, and please let me know if you have any questions on the topic. Thank you for listening.